In this lecture, we're concluding our section on Luther's biography by looking at his final years and, in the end, looking at his legacy. And we can begin by just noticing something very peculiar about some of the biographies of Luther. One of the things that always struck me whenever I first came to the subject was that the stories of Luther, inevitably, at least at the popular level, always seemed to end around 1531. The main focus, of course, was always from Luther and the Thunderstorm to Luther the Monk to Luther the Reformer, and even the focus on Luther's reforming efforts, whenever the story is told more quickly, always, I noticed, seemed to end roughly 15 or 16 years before his death. And I always found that curious, and it wasn't until much later in my studies that I began to piece together some of the reason that this might be the case. Because the fact of the matter is that Luther's Reformation, embodied in him personally, here is the man, the monk, who has stood up to the Catholic Church and who has provoked so many of the impulses that got the Protestant Reformation off the ground and that solidified it as a viable movement apart from the Catholic Church, that all of this context, in some ways, seems to be somewhat undermined by the rather frustrating and frankly troubling times of Luther later in his life. The end of the story, of course, is that Luther dies in 1546. And within a year, the armies of Charles V have attacked and assaulted the Schmalkaldic League and, by and large, have reimposed Catholicism across the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. For a period of time, in fact, it seemed as if the Lutheran Reformation had come to a swift and steady end. That after the man himself had passed away, that Charles had secured the Catholic faith once and for all in Germany, and that Luther would go the way of every other heretic in medieval history as a mere blip on the screen. Now, Lutheranism fought back, and they eventually won their freedom, at least in general, and of course that led down into the wars of religion and the rather torturous fighting between Catholics and Protestants for some time. But I think the way that you can sum up Luther in the end of his life is perhaps best encapsulated by a description that Heiko Obermann used of Luther, in which he said that Luther is the last medieval man. Now, he's of course being a bit coy here. Medieval is a name that historians give to people. They live in the Middle Ages, they're medieval people. But what Obermann means by this is that there are so many quirks and so many rough edges to who Luther was and the things that he believed. And as the years wore on, and for at least the last dozen or so years of his life, Luther grew increasingly alarming and full of vitriol against his opponents, that at times he doesn't appear to be very Protestant at all, at least not in the way that he shows charity to other Protestants, even those within his midst. There's also some troubling factors with Luther, which is the way that he embodies this radical anti-Semitism, which we're going to talk about in this lecture. At times, I've had students who, when they go through the full breadth of Luther's life, and after they've read a great deal of his writings, have come back and said, well, I have respect for him for what he stood for, but it's so very hard sometimes to love Luther when you get down to the actual portrait of the man, warts and all. And I think it's at this point that the Obermann caricature of Luther really comes into play here. Because in some ways, despite the fact that he was the man who championed justification by faith, Luther really is more Catholic than almost any other Protestant of the first generation of the Reformation. He, for example, still believed in baptismal regeneration, which is the view that you are actually saved in a manner of speaking, or that the Holy Spirit comes into the infant at the moment of baptism. Now, he doesn't believe it in the same way as the Catholic system, but Luther is always allergic to any idea that we somehow grab hold of Christ by our faith and that it's some sort of work of our own. In other words, he doesn't want faith to become the new works that we have to perform. And so he really stressed hard the idea that it's baptism that creates the faith in the Christian. We've also seen that Luther believes in physical eating in the Eucharist, and tries we might to distinguish it between that and transubstantiation of the Middle Ages. It certainly seems to be the case that Luther held on to some principle of physical eating that is not all that dissimilar from the Middle Ages. And of course, we're going to talk about this in the latter part of the course. What does Luther actually believe about physical eating, etc.? One of the other staggering things that most Protestants are unaware of is that Luther's view of Mary actually comport almost entirely with the modern Catholic views of Mary. In 1521, actually, Luther wrote a commentary on the Magnificat, which is the moment when the angel comes to Mary and tells her that she's going to be with child. And it's one of the key texts for understanding the biblical and the later history of the doctrine of Mary. Luther seemed to believe virtually all the doctrines that we associate with medieval understandings or Catholic understandings of Mary. He believed in her perpetual virginity. He doubts whether or not she was assumed into heaven, but he held to a number of the views of the medieval church on Mary. And we can make what we will of all of this, but it certainly needs to be stressed that there are parts of Luther that don't really fit some of the modern caricatures of Luther. There are so many Protestants and evangelicals today who base all of what they say or believe or think on the person of Luther. Frankly, anytime an evangelical gets into trouble with a group, they always seem to do a "Here I Stand" speech at some point. Or they claim that someone else is the Pharisee and that they are simply preaching the grace of the gospel. But so often, these people are not really basing what they believe on Luther, but on their impression of Luther. Because when you get down to the real Luther, there's really some strange bits sticking out of him that are so very medieval, so very not Protestant, that they don't only undermine him as the founder of the Protestant Reformation, but they do signal some of the interpretive challenges we have as to who Luther really is. And I think we can sum up Luther's final years with really two categories. There are the strengths of this period of time, and then there are the weaknesses. Now, as I've already indicated, there are going to be more weaknesses during this period of time than in previous decades or years in Luther's life. But there were strengths. There were moments or highlights of his life that are remembered all the way down until today. And the three things that really fall under the category of the strengths or the highlights, you might say, of Luther's later years are a couple of things. First and foremost, in 1535, Luther published his lengthy commentary on Galatians. In a manner of speaking, this commentary is the culmination of Luther's thinking on the subject of grace, and justification, and the law. This is actually one of the longest commentaries on Galatians written in the entirety of the 16th century. And it really is a masterpiece in terms of Luther's mature reflections on the subjects that sparked the Reformation themselves. Generation after generation have read it, have found it compelling, have found it interesting, but you have to understand that it is the most mature thing Luther will say on all of the subjects related to his Reformation breakthrough. Another highlight of this period of time, the latter years for Luther, is the table talk. And what the table talk is actually a series of informal conversations that Luther had with his students. Luther was always a gregarious man with those who were his disciples, or those who were there in Wittenberg with him. And from time to time, he would have students into his home. They would eat dinner together, have a beer or two, and Luther, lubricated by this point, would begin to discuss all manner of different things. Informal topics of practical ministry, or sometimes very substantive issues of the theology of his Reformation. And the reason we have the table talk is the students would sit there, and then several of them began to actually write down what Luther was saying. This really is sort of the epitome of Luther. He knew that people liked to record everything that came out of his mouth, and in this case, he liked to hold forth with the students and share his wisdom with them. And he knew they were writing it down, and he knew that eventually it would make its way out. And in these later years, in the table talk, we actually get a number of the stories of Luther's early years, of the Reformation, of his perspective on things, and in fact, some of the stories we actually have of Luther's Reformation breakthrough, or of his life as a monk, or of how he came to become the Protestant reformer that he became, really come from this table talk. It's Luther unplugged, you might say. It's Luther very informal, shooting from the hip and commenting on all kinds of things with his students. And we really have to thank them for writing it down because it's a window into Luther's life that we simply don't have otherwise. The third element that is a positive or a highlight for Luther is that Luther was a hymn writer. We actually have a number of hymns that were written by him personally. Now, at times, hymns are attributed to Luther that were not written by him, but were attributed to him. But he actually wrote quite a few. And obviously the most famous, and in some ways the most important one that he wrote, was "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Really sort of an anthem for Luther and his Reformation. It extols the glory of God's kingdom and how He is in charge and He has saved us. The hymn is sort of a poem to God and His mighty salvation that He has worked. And again, it's sort of telling in the very Lutheran way. He says nothing about our faithfulness or our having decided to follow Jesus, but rather it's God is the mighty fortress that shelters us. And there are other many highlights along the way which we won't get into, but there were highlights. There were moments of real clarity and moments that are really poignant and reflective for Luther during these years. And I say this because what we're about to delve into in terms of the weaknesses of these latter years, I don't want you to misread out of context as if everything in Luther's later years was simply awful. But we can't escape the fact that Luther, in his latter years, takes on elements and tones and positions that have a residual negative impact on Luther and his legacy. And the first one that we want to highlight is just simply the negativity and the vitriol that Luther comes up with. Now, at times, historians try to pin this on Luther's health. And in his latter years, Luther's health was poor. He was suffering from infirmities that, frankly, you or I would probably crumble under. I do remind students that this is a world that doesn't even yet have aspirin, much less some of the other medications or surgeries or procedures that the modern world has come to consider to be just normal. But the anger that Luther responds to people with during this time has struck so many scholars and historians and anyone who comes to Luther in this phase of his life as just simply, frankly, unbearable at times. I mean, it's telling that actually now I've just discovered there is actually a Luther insulter. Oh, I mean, just go Google it. Luther insulter. There's actually a website that has compiled all of the insults that Luther hurled at people over the years. And you keep clicking this button and new insults get hurled back at you as you sort of run through a litany of the things Luther said about people or to people that challenge their very right to be called Christians. And this really is an evolution of even the early Luther. We have noticed throughout that Luther does have a capacity for real serious attack. Even someone as similar to his positions as Zwingli gets dubbed the Schwärmer. And as Luther's years wear on, frankly, anyone who disagrees with him becomes the Schwärmerei, or the fanatics. And there's just something about Luther where as the years wore on, just about anyone who disagrees with him gets pinned with this label as a fanatic. And this is sort of idiosyncratic to Luther. Not always, in fact, very infrequently, will Luther take on an ad hominem argument where he attacks maybe the moral character of the person. It's not pure name-calling in the worst sense. This is the 16th century after all, and it was actually quite common in polemic to mock not only the ideas of your opponent, but also their life, their moral sanctity, etc. So Luther's not the only one. But there's something in Luther where he doesn't simply attack who they are morally, but rather he always seems to attack the conscience of that other person, that they are somehow deluded, or that the devil has convinced them of the erroneous doctrines that are so abhorrent. There is kind of an intellectual or a theological attack on people in which there is no room for good-hearted difference of opinion on the inconsequential doctrines or on the matters that are indifferent for the fundamentals of the faith. To cross Luther is to cross against the Bible's teachings. And this really is not just modern sensibilities run amok. It's not that we're just genteel people today and we read Luther and say, boy, what a jerk. Again, we know that Luther was not the only one to engage in polemic. But even Melanchthon, after Luther's death, refers to this tone within the first several generations of Lutherans as this kind of rabid fury. That there is this attack dog mentality that is sort of carried on by Luther, by some Lutherans, not all, by any means, but that there is always this tone of polemic in which to challenge the Lutheran perspective, to challenge Luther himself, is frankly to be anti-Christian, no matter how generously or how indifferently you might be challenging non-essential doctrines. And I'm not going to try and explain why this is happening. We do know that there was bouts of insomnia. Luther, till the day that he died, continued to talk about his Anfechtungen, that the devil was attacking him and trying to convince him of alternative positions. There's even one case where he describes one morning that he wakes up and that the devil begins to argue with him about the teachings of Zwingli. I mean, that's sort of striking. He believes that to consider or to debate any of the teachings of another Protestant is nothing less than debating with the devil himself. And so we just have to own this. This is Luther. His negativity, his vitriol was really idiosyncratic and somewhat hard to square with the man that is sort of the popular image that we have of Luther now as the great German man who talked about free grace. But it's there, and in the latter years in particular, it grows increasingly troublesome as it grows in volume and in ferocity. The second issue for Luther that many find troubling in these latter years is the rise of his anti-Semitism. Really, the anti-Semitism in Luther is one of those issues that historians and people who are fans of Luther have trouble really putting into context or finding a place for. Just as we saw in the lecture on politics, where some of Luther's legacy with the Nazi regime was leveraged in order to propel Germany into a particular national political view that paved the way for the rise of the Third Reich. In particular, Luther's anti-Semitism was leveraged by just about everyone at this point to justify many of the atrocities of the Holocaust. Hitler's right-hand men, for example, were known to be fans of Luther's anti-Semitic rants that come from the latter decade of his life. And we need to sort of tell this story because we have to understand it and we have to look it square in the eye. In 1523, there was this sort of heady optimism by Luther that he was going to win the German peoples to the faith. In 1523, for example, he wrote a book called Jesus Was Born a Jew, in which he lays out a paradigm in which the Jewish people should just simply embrace the faith because now that the Protestant regime was in place and that it was on the ascendancy, that the true gospel of the true Messiah could now be communicated to those who were Jewish in the German regions. Well, by and large, that is all he really says on the subject for a number of years. Suddenly, though, in 1543, Luther published a book called On the Jews and Their Lies. And this is, without a doubt, one of the most important and the most heinous anti-Semitic rants of the entire history of anti-Semitism. And we just have to simply call it that. There's really no getting around the language that Luther uses here or the things that he calls for in this book. We can give it some context. Historians of anti-Semitism have commented that the language that Luther uses in this book is not typical anti-Semitism, which is born mostly out of an issue of racism, nor is it part of the more medieval hysteria about Jews and the blood libel as Messiah killers. Luther doesn't rehash any of those more traditional arguments of anti-Semitism. Still, historians have also pointed out that Luther's comments are actually more violent than some of even the most hysterical medieval texts against Jews. Luther actually in the text calls for the following actions. He says that synagogues ought to be burned to the ground, all throughout Germany. Just burn them all. He also argues that the property owned by Jews throughout Germany ought to be confiscated. And then finally, that the Jews should be expelled entirely from the German regions. Again, even in the most heinous comments in the Middle Ages, the hysteria, etc., that you sometimes see around, for example, the times of the Crusades, you rarely, if ever, get a comment like this, that Jews ought to be forced not to worship, that their synagogues should be burned entirely, and that Jews en masse ought to be expelled from Germany. Luther goes on to say that the Jews speak for the devil. They lie. And he makes some allegations that there had been some Jews who were converting Christians to Judaism. And that seems to be sort of the nugget of the issue in Luther's mind, that here were Christians, ostensibly Protestants and Lutherans, who had come over to the Jewish faith because of some proselytizing by Jews. And so this book is just simply an anti-Semitic rant calling for violence against the Jewish people. Again, for Luther, the Jews are not simply wrong, they're not simply problems that they simply won't convert to the faith. Rather, they are inherently diabolical. And he justifies his tirade and the call for all of this action against the Jews on the text of Deuteronomy 13, where it said that the Jewish nation is to kill idolaters and burn the cities to the ground. But Luther uses this text in a somewhat ironic twist, frankly, to justify action against the Jewish people. And there's a couple of strange things that Luther does here. First and foremost, Luther makes the claim that the Old Testament is actually Christian, not Jewish. And sometimes people scratch their head about that. It seems to make no sense. Well, Luther is basing this on some of the New Testament passages, of course. For example, Peter, that talk about how the Old Testament people looked to the culmination and the fulfillment of the prophecies, and that after the cross and the resurrection and Pentecost, there is a sense in which they looked forward to the time that Christians can now live in the fulfillment of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. And so when he says that the Old Testament is Christian, he means in this a theological or a hermeneutical position, that it's Christians who are reading the Old Testament correctly. In other words, he's saying that Jews do not read the Old Testament correctly, that they pervert it, and that they are persuaded by the lies of the devil to believe that the Old Testament is in keeping with their faith. And Luther really doesn't only write the one track. For the remainder of his life, for the last 3 years, there is something of an anti-Semitic tirade going on so frequently in his mind. In fact, according to the records, the very last sermon that Luther preached, the day before he died, was an openly anti-Semitic rant, more fervent and more, frankly, hysterical than even this book on the Jews and their lies. And so it's probably no wonder then why the Nazi regime and why the anti-Semitism within Germany in the early part of the 20th century reached back and grabbed a hold of Luther's comments here. Again, we just simply have to look this in the eye. This is not a one-off thing. This is not a stray letter. This is an openly published book and a series of tirades for the last 3 years of Luther's life, where he takes on this position that he wants the Jews expelled from Germany entirely. And in fact, so problematic is this legacy of Luther's that actually when historians got together to compile the complete works of Luther, they actually debated long and hard whether or not to include this book. And that's telling, because here was a committee coming together to compile everything that Luther had written, letters, table talk, everything. And so concerned were they of the legacy of this book and of Luther's anti-Semitism that they considered taking the frankly unique position that it was too dangerous to simply reassert into publication. And people who love Luther have to take this into account. This is not simply a man confused or a man unable to reckon with the reality of the day. Nor is this simply Luther as a man of his times. Frankly, there is not one other shred of evidence that Protestantism in general shared many or, frankly, very much of any of these perspectives. There's actually a long history, for example, of the Swiss reformers, the people that we're going to call the Reformed tradition, of having a relatively healthy interaction with Jewish people. Certainly not great by any standards of today, but certainly no one published anything like On the Jews and Their Lies during the course of the Reformation besides Luther. And so maybe one of the ways to look at it is, while Luther's legacy on the relationship of politics and violence is murky, it simply is the case that Luther is one of the fathers, frankly, of German anti-Semitism. And so if we're going to take an honest look at the man, this is one of the things that we have to reckon with. Now, to sum up, the legacy of Luther is varied and complex. On the one hand, he was, as Calvin called him, the apostle of the Reformation. He was the man without whom there would be no Reformation, frankly. He led the charge. He was first to the front lines, and he put his life on the line from the very beginning in order to champion his Reformation breakthrough and his understanding of the teachings of Paul and the New Testament on justification. He also contributed enormously to the conversation theologically and pastorally of the legacy of Protestantism. He wasn't always clear on his doctrines, but then not everyone was. And so we can't hold him to account for sometimes being idiosyncratic. And even though some of his views were frankly medieval, or had this tone that was so idiosyncratic to Luther, like his Mariology or his view of the sacraments, for example. Still, Luther is Luther, and in terms of the founder of Protestantism, he is the one man that gets the pride of place in terms of the man who started it all. Still, the legacy is marked by a number of troubling things, frankly, for modern interpreters, and there's no explaining this away. Luther's legacy of anger and frustration and an all-or-nothing approach to his perspective on theology frankly contributed to the long legacy of Lutheranism. In fact, for a long time, Lutheran just simply meant German. It was considered to be an insular faith, an insular confession of Protestantism. And that's why, for example, you don't have a promiscuous mix of various denominational differences within the Lutheran tradition. By and large, most who come from the Lutheran tradition, who formed denominations or churches end up calling themselves Lutheran. Well, if you compare that with the Reformed and the Swiss, who were relatively weak in their power base and who were desperate at times for networks of connections and of people who are like-minded around Europe, you see this kind of opposite push. The Reformed people were as promiscuous as you get, theologically speaking. So you get Reformed movements in France, in the Netherlands, in England, in Scotland, in Switzerland, and even in southern Germany. And the long legacy of the Reformed tradition was one of attempts at compromise and of attempting to spread the Reformed perspective on things in as many different contexts as possible. Now, that's not to say that one is good and one is bad, but rather the legacy of Luther and of the theology of Luther in general is that it really sort of forms an all-or-nothing system in many ways. It's hard, for example, to consider someone Lutheran until really the 20th century if they don't embrace the full spectrum of Luther's perspectives on things like the Eucharist or the two kingdoms or any of a number of other doctrines. To be Lutheran, not surprisingly following Luther himself, has historically meant to follow the teachings to a T of the great man Martin Luther. Okay, that's it for Luther. We have gone all the way through his context and his life, and in our next lecture, we're going to kick off lectures on Calvin and Calvinism.